back in my comfy spot for a book. I've got just enough time to get us another book in. And this one's going to be one of the more serious topics. I have a few of these, a very small collection of books that we'll have called social psychology, social engineering, subject matter. And this one is called The Manipulated Mind by Denise Winn. And it's a book talks about brainwashing, conditioning, and indoctrination, and kind of how that works, and why we're weak to this, why we're susceptible to this. And this is part of a series of books. I can't put all the books on one playlist, but it's part of a series of topics on social engineering, and like we're going to do Edward Bernays' propaganda. We're going to do the Psychology of the Crowd by Gustav Le Bon. Influence. I forget who that's by. Caladini, somebody. But and the Guru Papers. Oh, by Joel something. Joel Kramer. Yeah. Anyway, that's a really excellent book. And then after we have, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be after, but in the pretend theory planning board that we're on right now, I have a fiction book, a really good fiction book. It's an adult fiction book. So, well, I didn't say that all my stories and books here were going to be kids-oriented, or even stories or alls in. I told you it was going to be selections from my library. Because you know where this book's going to end up when I die? Landfill. Eventually. So at least I can lift the words from it, put them out in the air for any who will. I'm going to turn this that way so I'm not distracted and I can focus on reading. There's 10 chapters in the book. I'm going to try to read 2 chapters per video. Thank you for joining me. I can even make education fun. Alright. Oh, and I don't have a lot of time, so I hope I get this done good. Introduction. The term brainwashing made its debut in print in an article published by the Miami News, September 1950. The author, Edward Hunter, coined the word as a rather down-market translation of the Chinese "snao," which meant to cleanse the mind, and used the article to claim that post-revolution China was using insidious, never-before-known psychological techniques to force the Chinese into the Communist Party. He followed this up with other articles and books on the subject, and by the end of the Korean War it seemed quite clear to the American public, at least, that American POWs who had collaborated with the enemy had had no choice. They were the innocent victims of a mind control exercise extraordinaire, a technique originally developed to persuade the Chinese of the correctness of the communist line, and then applied to enemy captives. The brainwashing concept was let loose on a receptive audience. It was a shock, after all, to find that so many of the American boys captured in Korea wavered rather widely from the national line. The exact number of soldiers, to some degree, who went over to the other side varied according to the sobriety of different source material. Authors, such as psychologist expert Jost Merleau, who are fearful of the effects of mass manipulation, cite that 7,190 U.S. prisoners held in China, 70% were swayed by the communist propaganda to make confessions or sign petitions calling for the end of the war. Though few remained communist after the war and repatriation, just a few. Okay. Less dramatic versions of events cite 1/3 of American POWs taking up the communist cause. Either way, the figure was high enough to shock Americans into embracing the brainwashing explanation and to numb them perhaps to the equally glaring fact that few British POWs and few, if any, Turks who suffered the same treatments capitulated. The repatriated American POW became, quite understandably, a phenomenon fit for study by numerous psychologists and psychiatrists, keen to unravel what, if anything, brainwashing was, and, if it wasn't, what had led the boys to undergo dramatic reductions in their allegiance to the president and country. It had been the role of much later investigators of events to posit the idea that the big brainwashing scare was fostered by the CIA. Hunter, who introduced the term, was, after all, a CIA employee when he worked on the subject. Not only was he a journalist, but a propaganda specialist, and had also served as psychological warfare specialist in the Pentagon, according to Shevlin and Opton, authors of The Mind of Manipulators, who investigated his biographical data. He set the scene in his first book for conveying the message that the United States was under attack by an enemy using secret mind control tactics, and that only through equally covert counter-activities could this threat be removed. It is not, however, the subject of this book to look at the resultant activities of the CIA as they investigated the potential of hypnosis, programming, drugs, etc. to gain control of the mind. Several books which have been published on this theme seem to indicate that the CIA reaped embarrassment rather than enlightenment from its efforts. It is relevant, however, to consider the origins of the word brainwashing, because it is an interesting case of a word being coined to encapsulate a concept, for whatever reasons, and then, instead of the concept being the focus of the study, the word itself becoming the target of interest. Many psychological experts are intrepid investigators who looked into the subject. Some have concentrated on proving that brains cannot be washed. End of matter. Others have concluded that brainwashing is a powerful, all-persuasive technique, allowing first domination of the individual and then domination of the world. Jost Merleau calls it political conditioning and claims, political conditioning should not be confused with training, persuasion, or even indoctrination. It is more than that. It is taming. It is taking possession of both the simplest and the most complicated nervous pattern of man. The totalitarian wants first the required response from the nerve cells, then control of the individual, and finally control of the masses. From Mental Seduction and Menticide. Then there is this view, put by Shevlin and Opton, that brainwashing was and is an emotional scare word, serving only to prevent our having to face embarrassing or unpalatable truths. It was convenient, for example, to claim that Patty Hearst was brainwashed into taking the aims of a revolutionary group that kidnapped her in 1974, rather than face the possible fact that even symbols of the success of the American way of life could undergo radical change. What might now, in the 80s, this book came out in the 80s? Cool. What might now in the 80s seem an academic argument has instead become a new relevant interest, in the light of the recent proliferation of religious cults whose members, many claim, are brainwashed into joining. In March 1981, an English High Court jury decided that the Mooney cult does brainwash people. The word was used. After hearing an action brought on by the cult against the Daily Mail newspaper, which had printed allegations that the church breaks up families. The court case has again focused attention on the concept of coercion, unwitting or otherwise, of unsuspecting people. all the old questions have once again been asked. What exactly is brainwashing? Is it possible to force any thinking person to adopt a lifestyle completely alien to his assumed inclinations? Well, how does brainwashing differ from indoctrination, or from the equally insidious influencing effects of advertising or the education system? Or are they perhaps all the same thing? Analysis of the concept of brainwashing has been made difficult by the fact that it has never really been accepted as a technical word. The graphic image created by Hunter was perhaps no more than an impressionistic sketch passed down over the years to be embellished or erased according to predilection. For some, the picture has very specific component parts, without all of which it could not be seen as a whole. For others, it is a blurred canvas, and all of human life is hidden there. Such a malleable concept can only arouse fear, contempt, or confusion. According to one's definition of the word, one believes in it or one does not. Robert Lifton, who made an intensive study in Hong Kong of a number of Western and Chinese civilians whom the Chinese had tried to convert to communism after the revolution, and published his findings in Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, which makes a very valuable point in his introduction, saying, "Behind this web of semantic and more than semantic confusion lies the image of brainwashing as an all-powerful, irresistible, unfathomable, and magical method of achieving total control over the human mind. It is, of course, none of these things, and this loose usage makes a rallying point for fear, resentment, urges toward submission, justification for failure, irresponsible accusation, and for a wide gamut of emotional extremism. One may justly conclude that the term has a far from precise and questionable usefulness. One may even be tempted to forget about the whole subject. Yet to do so would be to overlook one of the major problems in our era, that of the psychology and ethics of directed attempts at changing human beings. For despite the vicissitudes of brainwashing, the process which gave rise to the name is very much a reality. Several psychological experts who examined American soldiers who were repatriated from Korea concluded that brainwashing was not a new technique, but a clever combination of many, each familiar and comprehensible on its own. This present book, aided by the more recent findings about human behavior that have been emanated from the field of psychology, aims to look at those processes which, in some, have variously been described as brainwashing, to see how each individually operates to influence us all in our daily lives. How far do indoctrination, conditioning, need for social approval, emotional dependency, and much else prevent us from being as self-directed as we would like to imagine? Demystifying brainwashing, the ultimate change process, can perhaps serve to highlight much about the workings of the ordinary human mind. For the factors that can be combined to force such sudden change are perhaps equally responsible in their various combinations and unconsciously over time for the formation of our characters in the first place, which may make us question the foundations instead of the facade. I am grateful to all the authors of the many books on brainwashing, indoctrination, and conditioning that are reviewed in the following pages, and should like to recommend the reader to the full bibliography at the back of this book, as all make fascinating reading. Chapter 2. Brainwashing. To isolate the components of so-called brainwashing process it is necessary to take a detailed look at what went on in the Chinese prisoners of war camps in Korea. The American soldiers repatriated in 1953, who had seemingly collaborated with the enemy and adopted a communist viewpoint, albeit briefly, were not the first to focus world attention on the phenomenon of sudden political conversion. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin's Moscow show trials, where top Bolshevik figures publicly confessed to utterly fantastic crimes that they could not possibly have committed, and even seemed to willingly adopt their persecutors' view of them as scum, caused alarm to ripple far abroad. That staunch revolutionaries could suddenly have been transformed into groveling repentance was unthinkable. That some insidious process was at work became a reality for the Americans when their own men later succumbed to the Chinese and made equally fantastic confessions, in some cases, that the Americans had been engaged in biological warfare against the communists. So the experts were called in to try to find explanations. Their detailed analysis of the characters of the men, the stresses they were obliged to undergo, and the tactics used by the Chinese to provide the most comprehensive picture of what have been called brainwashing. In later years, claims made in court that individuals such as Patty Hearst or members of cults had been brainwashed have all been based on the findings arising from Korea. Different experts have placed different emphasis on the events that occurred and have sometimes offered up differing conclusions. It is worth reviewing their evaluations and drawing together all the common threads. Edgar Schein, an MIT psychologist, gathered his data in August 1953 at Incheon, Korea, when the repatriates were being processed. And on board the USNS General Black, when the men were en route back to the United States during the first 2 weeks of September. In an article called The Indoctrination Program for Prisoners of War, a study of attempted brainwashing, published in Psychiatry, 1956, he outlined what had happened to the soldiers in Korea, as told by them to him, and drew his own conclusions. He claimed, as a result of his investigations, that there was nothing new and terrifying about brainwashing techniques. They had in effect combined a number of traditional and well-known ploys to weaken resistance, such as group discussion, self-criticism, interrogation, rewards and punishments, forced confessions, exposure to propaganda, and information control. What was new was not the method, but the manner of combining, in a systematic fashion, a variety of tried and tested methods. The following description of events experienced in Korean POW camps is drawn from Schein's published version. The bad guys' attitude to their captives differed, The bad guys' attitude to their captives differed even at the outset from that of the North Koreans, whereas the latter were brutal to their prisoners, took their clothing away, deprived them of regular and sufficient food, and meted out heavy punishment or death if a prisoner tried to resist them. The bad guys welcomed captives with warmth, even congratulating them for having been liberated. Over the next weeks and months, however, the soldiers suffered severe physical and psychological pressures, and implicit in most of what the bad guys said or did was the suggestion that these stresses would be removed, and life would be much happier if they took up a more cooperative attitude to their captors. The men had to undergo long marches, lasting maybe 2 weeks, en route to the prison camp assigned for them. During the march, they received little food, and in the interest of survival, were first forced to compete with each other for what scant food, clothing, and shelter was on offer, which, Sheen says, made it impossible for them to maintain group ties. Throughout, the bad guys raised the men's hope by promising improvements in conditions, though stays in temporary camps along the way were no improvement whatsoever, and then dashed them by explaining that the UN was being obstructive, or that too many prisoners were being uncooperative and therefore all would have to suffer. Propaganda leaflets were distributed, and then the men were forced to sing communist songs. Permanent camp, when it was finally reached, however, forced the men to suffer physical and psychological stresses far beyond what they had so far endured. Shine does not here detail the physical tortures imposed upon the men, but Merleau lists a number that were included in the official American and British reports. These included standing to attention or sitting with legs outstretched in complete silence from 4:30 until 11 p.m., and constantly being awoken during the few hours allowed for sleep. Enduring solitary confinements in boxes 5 feet by 3 feet by 2 feet. One soldier was known to have spent 6 months in such a box. Having liquids withheld for days to help the self-reflection. Being bound with a rope, one end of which was passed over a beam around and then around the neck like a hangman's noose, and the other around the ankles. The prisoner was then told that if he slipped or bent his knees, he would be no longer. Of his own doing, of course. This is why we fight for our freedom, children. This is why we fight to have our voice and our opinion and our conservative ways, so that people don't get to do this shit to us. That's why. That's why I'm educating you with what it is, because it's never gone away. We have never gotten modern. This is not new. Strengthen your mind. Strengthen your mind and don't become a slave. Being forced to kneel on jagged rocks with arms stretched above the head, holding a large boulder. This is how the government helps you stay in line. Okay? So reflect. This stuff is just frightening to think that people do this. Being obliged in one camp to hold in the mouth a slim piece of wood or metal that a jailer pushed through the hole in the cell door. Suddenly, the jailer would knock the outer end of the wood or metal sideways, usually breaking the teeth or splitting open his mouth. Being forced to march barefoot on to a frozen river where water was poured over their feet. Prisoners then had to stand for hours, frozen to the ice, reflecting on their crimes. According to Sheen's account, the prisoners had to get up at dawn, exercise for an hour, and then, after cereal or potato soup for breakfast at 8 a.m., spend the day assigned to duties or undergoing indoctrination. Whether a midday meal was served or not depended on the prisoner's attitude. Living groups comprised of 10 to 15 people, and the bad guys, were careful to separate the men by race and rank, as well as to undermine the established structure of the group, particularly by removal of leaders. Bearing out the insistence from the bad guys that rank was irrelevant, they were all of one brotherhood now. Sometimes very young or bubbling prisoners would be put in charge of the rest. If any spontaneous semblance of order arose among the men, the bad guys broke up the group. Personal affiliations and ties were consistently weakened. The men were not allowed any religious expression, and often their mail from home was withheld, though the bad guys maintained that no one was writing because no one at home cared what happened to them. Throughout, bad guys were attempting to recruit men to so-called peace committees. Those that joined then had to play a part in the indoctrination by trying to prevent resistance from among the other men and to produce propaganda leaflets to aid the cause, but under the guise of camp recreation activities. Awareness that this was going on made such groups as did form among the men weak and unstable because of fears that informers might be in their midst. Sheen divides the bad guys' attack on the Americans' beliefs, attitudes, and values into two kinds, direct and indirect. Direct methods include daily lectures, 2 or 3 hours in length, to the content of which was considered with disparaging the United Nations, the United States in particular, and praising communist countries, forcing prisoners to sign peace petitions and confessions, and making radio appeals and speeches calling for peace. She notes that individual confessions regarding the United States' use of germ warfare were particularly damaging to the men who heard them. Whereas most found the lectures naive and inaccurate, they were more profoundly impressed by the explanations of how these bombs had been used by America to put them by a couple of their own officers who actually traveled from camp to camp for this purpose, or put to them, as told to them by a couple of their own officers who actually traveled from camp to camp for that purpose. Men who had formerly believed the germ warfare accusations to be pure propaganda found themselves questioning their validity after all. Indirect methods included interrogation on American military techniques, which were heavy on psychological pressure. The interrogations might last for whole weeks, with the interrogator actually living with the prisoner and being extremely friendly toward the man. During interrogation, statements made by the prisoner were reviewed repeatedly, in the demand that the prisoner resolve all inconsistencies between early and later versions. When a man refused to answer questions, he might be forced to copy down someone else's answer into a notebook. That might have seemed to the man an ineffectual way of trying to make him change his own opinions. What might have seemed to the man an ineffectual way of trying to make him change his own opinions to things he was writing was in fact used for a very different purpose. His writings were shown to the other prisoners to dupe them into believing that he had voluntarily composed them himself. All the men were regularly made to confess before each other or to criticize themselves in public if they broke the rules of the camp. There were very many trivial rules. Prisoners found this particularly humiliating. The bad guys made the most of the effects that the use of rewards could bring. Prisoners who cooperated were offered special favors, food and clothing. Others were tantalized to cooperate by promises of repatriation. The men were also so starved of contact with their families that they would willingly incorporate propaganda peace appeals into their letters home, and they were an assurance that the letters would be sent. Some made propaganda broadcasts purely as a way of letting their relatives know they were alive. Whether the motive, the effect was that other prisoners suspected that they had fully cooperated with the enemy and became mistrustful. So many who lost the friendship of the group continued to cooperate for real. Shine saw the bad guys' tactics as working insofar as they did because of the following reasons. The soldiers first had to contend with immense and debilitating physical privations. In this weakened state, they had to cope with the severe psychological pressure of fear that they would never be repatriated at all, or that they would die or suffer terrible reprisals. They were also in a position where their normal beliefs, values, and attitudes were constantly being undermined by their captors, thus preventing their maintaining a strong and constant sense of self. The confusion induced could in no way be alleviated by validating themselves against their peers, as group ties were systematically destroyed. Each man was alone to question his role in life. Mutual distrust, fostered by the unknown existence of informers and the feared existence of informers, where perhaps there were none, could only confirm each man in his isolation. The confusion of it became insupportable. The confusion, if it became unsupportable, could be alleviated in one sure way: collaboration with the communists. For that was the only certainty on offer. The bad guys, for their part, consolidated their gains by other specific psychological tactics. They used repetition to break a man down, making their demands and accusations over and over and over again until, worn out, the prisoners gave in. They operated a careful pacing of demands, starting with trivial requests and gradually working up to the highest demands. They forced the prisoner to participate in his own conversion. To participate in our own conversion. Do make note what us hateful right-wingers are trying to do here. Not. Listening quietly to lectures was never enough. The man had to make responses, verbally or in writing. Finally, by crouching their indoctrination in the guise of a plea for peace, the bad guys were able to appeal to the all too worn down and war-weary soldier. Schein's view was that no one stress is entirely responsible or overly responsible for the breakdown that could lead to so-called brainwashing. Drs. Lawrence Hinkle Jr. and Harold Wolff have asserted, oh my, guess what? Holy cow. Woo! 2 chapters a day, I said. Ha 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 ha. Oi. No. We are not doing that. 2 chapters a day, I said. Okay. Not 2 chapters a day. We might not be able to do this book as well as I wanted to. Okay, stopping point.